The first rule of society is never to tell the truth. This is the story of Lord Cassian Vale, the Marquess of Atherton. Brilliant, beautiful, and utterly bored, Cassian had perfected the art of performance. His world was a stage of debauchery, where every affair was meaningless, every bet was reckless, and every act was a defiant lie against the suffocating expectations of his rank. He believed in no one, especially not himself. This is also the story of Eleanor Sharpe, the Governess. Unyielding, fiercely intelligent, and armed only with her principles, Eleanor had perfected the art of survival. Her moral rigor was an armor against a world that had stolen her family's fortune. She was utterly honest, brutally pragmatic, and saw through every single one of Cassian's expensive lies. What began as a calculated war of wills would become a dangerous, intoxicating game. The battlefield, a grand estate full of secrets. The prize, not an inheritance, but the chance to tear down the walls they had both spent a lifetime building. Get ready for high stakes, scorching tension, and a battle where the winner might just be the one who surrenders first. If you love a story where the hero must be brought to his knees by the heroine's sheer intelligence, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. You won't want to miss a single chapter of this epic enemies to lovers saga. Now, let the game begin. Chapter 1. The Rake's Burden. Lord Cassian Vale, the 6th Marquess of Atherton, was meticulously bored. He wasn't bored in the common way, mind you, not the tedious boredom of a provincial curate. His was the sophisticated ennui of a man who possessed everything that society considered valuable: a breathtaking estate, a vast fortune, a pedigree that outranked the royal line on the continent, and a face that guaranteed him entry to any boudoir or gaming hell in the capital, yet found the whole glittering spectacle utterly pointless. He sat behind his massive mahogany desk in the library of Atherton Hall, a chamber meant for contemplative study, and meticulously constructed a castle out of playing cards, the king of clubs balanced precariously atop the queen of spades. The morning light, usually an intrusion, filtered through the leaded windows and illuminated the wreckage of the previous night's revelry: 2 empty bottles of French claret, a discarded velvet slipper, and a faintly scorched carpet where a cigar had been carelessly dropped. His father's ultimatum, delivered via a blistering letter that arrived with the dawn, lay open beside his masterpiece. Your latest public disgrace at Almack's has cemented your reputation as a debauched wastrel, a title I had hoped to avoid adding to the Vale lineage. Unless you assume control of your sister, Lady Lydia, and prepare her for a respectable season by the next quarter, I shall reroute the estate's entire trust into her dowry, leaving you to sober up in a debtor's prison. Tame your sister, Cassian, or lose your inheritance. Cassian sighed, a deep, performative sound that shook the delicate card structure. It collapsed. Tame, he murmured, picking up a stray ace. It was a word that rankled him, suggesting a wild beast, an unmanageable problem. Lydia wasn't a problem. She was merely 17, clever as a whip, and bored with precisely the same society that bored him. Her recent scandal, trading her riding habit for a footman's livery to escape her chaperone and attend a clandestine lecture on botany, was, in his estimation, an act of intellectual curiosity, not rebellion. But his father was not concerned with botany. He was concerned with the lineage, the money, and the appearance of control. Cassian hated the ultimatum, but he was too intellectually lazy, too comfortable in his gilded rut to actually fight it. Appeasing his father's demands was the simplest path back to his preferred state of indolence. But he had no intention of actually taming Lydia. That required effort and emotional honesty, 2 things he had assiduously avoided since he was 20. The solution was simpler: hire a governess so draconian, so insufferable, that Lydia would rebel spectacularly, giving him the perfect, irrefutable excuse to send the problem and the governess packing. He picked up a second piece of correspondence, a terse, handwritten reply to an advertisement he had placed for a highly experienced, strictly moral, and utterly unyielding instructress. It was from a Miss E. Sharpe, and the references were a litany of nervous praise. The girls were perfectly transformed. Her command is absolute. I would not dare argue with her logic. Cassian smiled, a cold, predatory gleam entering his eyes for the first time that morning. Miss Eleanor Sharpe. Her reputation preceded her, an iron wall of discipline and decorum. She sounded like the perfect insufferable woman. The clock in the hall chimed the half-hour. Cassian, having finally dressed in a velvet coat of deep emerald green, calculated to offend the senses, stood before his fireplace, one arm propped on the mantel. He had arranged the room for maximum intimidation. The shutters were drawn, leaving the space shadowy. The desk was strewn with ledgers and half-written betting slips, and he himself had adopted an expression of profound, negligent contempt. A footman announced, "Miss Eleanor Sharpe, my lord." The woman who entered was not what he had expected. He had envisioned a dried-up spinster in a gray bombazine gown and spectacles. Miss Sharpe was certainly not fashionable. Her dress was plain, serviceable black broadcloth, severely buttoned to the neck, but she was neither frail nor faded. She was tall, with a figure that was all sharp, elegant lines, and a carriage that spoke of genuine, not learned, pride. Her hair, the dark color of wet earth, was pulled back with an unforgiving severity that highlighted the high, intelligent curve of her brow and the striking green of her eyes. They were not soft, feminine eyes. They were clear, assessing, and entirely unreadable. She walked into his shadowy office and simply waited. "Miss Sharpe," Cassian drawled, not moving from the mantel, allowing the silence to stretch. He let his gaze linger on her a moment too long, a subtle, insolent assessment of her person. "Do sit." She moved to the chair he gestured to, but did not sit down. "Lord Vale, I prefer to stand. I find it aids focus." Her voice was low, precisely articulated, and utterly devoid of warmth. The refusal, subtle and polite, was the first dart in their game. Cassian smiled internally. "Ah, yes, focus," he said, pushing himself off the mantel and walking toward his desk. He did not ask her about her qualifications. He already knew them. He did not ask her why she was applying. The answer, for a woman in her precarious position, was always the same. He settled into his chair, propped his polished Hessian squarely on the corner of the desk, and laced his fingers behind his head. The effect was meant to be one of flagrant disregard. "Let us dispense with the tiresome pleasantries, Miss Sharpe," he said, his tone dripping with veiled insults. "You have an excellent reputation as a woman who can achieve discipline. I have a sister, Lady Lydia, who is, to put it kindly, wild. She has a tendency toward intellectual pursuits that are, shall we say, unbecoming of a lady in her station. She is also headstrong, willful, and deeply resistant to authority." Eleanor Sharpe's expression did not flicker. "I read the reports regarding the incident with the lecture on botany, my lord. It sounds like she possesses commendable courage and intellectual spirit." Cassian raised an eyebrow, genuinely surprised. "Commendable? Most would call it a scandal." "Most are fools who prefer simpering idiocy to genuine thought," she returned coolly. "My role is not to turn her into a mindless ornament, Lord Vale. It is to ensure that her mind and her courage are channeled into a form that society will accept, so that she may survive its limitations with her dignity intact." The answer was too honest, too sharp. It punctured the light, contemptuous air he had tried to create. He waved a dismissive hand. "Dignity. Right. Let's talk about the true currency here. The position is a temporary one. I expect my sister to find you so draconian, so utterly unfun, that she will stage a rebellion spectacular enough for me to dismiss you and send her away to a finishing school on the continent, a far more permanent solution." He leaned forward, dropping his feet to the floor, his dark eyes locking onto her resolute green ones. "In short, Miss Sharpe, you have been hired to be my tool in an act of paternalistic manipulation. Your primary purpose is not instruction, but instigation. You are not to succeed. You are to be an effective failure." He pulled out a check, already filled in for a quarter's wages, an enormous sum for a governess. "The pay is double your usual rate, payable upon your arrival. A bribe for your conscience, perhaps. What is your price, Miss Sharpe?" There was a pregnant silence. Cassian watched for the blush, the stammer, the flicker of outrage, or the greed that he always found in people. Eleanor Sharpe met his gaze without flinching. Her eyes held not the outrage he expected, but a deep, profound disdain, a look that suggested he was an insect, amusing only in his pathetic attempts at grandeur. "My price, Lord Vale," she said, her voice dangerously soft, "is that you honor the contract. I will have the proper references upon my departure, regardless of whether it is by your dismissal or the term's end. I need the reference, desperately." She stepped forward, placing her palm flat on his desk, mere inches from his hand. "And the double pay, while generous, is not a bribe for my conscience. It is compensation for the sheer insult of having to wear a man who is so rich, so handsome, and so entirely wasted. I accept the position. I will not fail in my duties to Lady Lydia, however short my tenure. And I promise you, my lord, I will take every penny." She picked up the check, folded it neatly, and slipped it into her sparse reticule. "The game," she said, with the barest, most cutting hint of a smile, "is indeed on. Where shall I instruct the footman to deposit my luggage?" Cassian Vale watched the governess turn and walk toward the door, her spine rigid, her head high. He felt an entirely new sensation, a surge of fury mixed with a thrilling, unexpected spark of intrigue. She hadn't been shocked, she hadn't been shamed, and she hadn't been bought. She had merely taken his insult, acknowledged his transparent game, and raised the stakes with her icy politeness. He had hired the strictest, most unfun woman in England to drive his sister mad. He had just realized he might have hired the one woman in England capable of driving him mad. "The south suite, Miss Sharpe," he called out to her, retreating back. "Overlooking the gardens. The lessons begin tomorrow morning. Sharp!" She paused at the door, turning only her head. The green eyes were promised silent war. "Indeed, my lord," Eleanor Sharpe replied. "Very sharp." Chapter 2. The Dawn of Disdain. Lord Cassian Vale was not accustomed to waking before noon. The hour was, to him, a social and spiritual wasteland fit only for tradesmen, dairymaids, and the painfully virtuous. Yet the perverse thrill of his new game with Miss Eleanor Sharpe had injected a disturbing vitality into his schedule. He intended to stage the perfect scandal, and a true scandal required a morning audience. He spent the entire night ensuring the scene was set. By 5 in the morning, Atherton Hall was vibrating with the final throes of a deliberately debauched party. Cassian had invited the worst sort of company, not merely gamblers, but poets who recited terrible verse, ladies who had worn their reputations thin, and a pair of twin brothers whose primary talent was drinking brandy from a chandelier. At a little past 6, the party began to spill out of the main drawing room and into the grand marble foyer. Half-empty glasses of champagne sat on priceless antique tables. The scent of stale wine and cheaper perfume hung heavy in the air. 2 gentlemen were attempting to play leapfrog over a suit of ancestral armor. Cassian, leaning against a pillar with a smirk of anticipation, ensured the music. A jarring cacophony from a hired band refusing to quit was loud enough to carry into the newly occupied south wing. His footman had informed him that Miss Sharpe was meticulous about time. She would descend the main staircase at precisely 7:30 for her breakfast before meeting Lady Lydia at 8. The seconds ticked by, and Cassian felt a giddy, reckless excitement. He had expected blushes, stammers, a note of resignation left on the silver tray, or, at the very least, a horrified retreat back to her chambers. This was his masterpiece of calculated chaos, a direct challenge to her rigid morality. The clock struck 7:30. The noise was at its peak. Eleanor Sharpe appeared at the top of the sweeping grand staircase. Cassian watched, every muscle tense. She wore the same severe black dress, her hair pinned back with impossible neatness. She stopped on the landing, her figure framed by the morning light struggling through the high windows. The gentlemen froze mid-leapfrog. The babbling voices quieted. The band faltered, silenced not by her presence, but by the sheer, unblinking authority of her gaze. Eleanor did not blush. She did not stammer. She did not even flinch. She merely assessed the entire scene. Her expression was not one of horror, but of profound, unadulterated disdain. It was the look a surgeon might give a badly botched amputation. Cassian pushed himself off the pillar, a triumphant sneer already forming on his lips. "Good morning, Miss Sharpe. Early to rise, I see. My apologies for the liveliness. A few late-night callers who appear to have overstayed their welcome." Eleanor descended the stairs slowly, deliberately, her eyes sweeping over the scattered bodies and the overturned furniture. "Liveliness, my lord? I had not realized this was a tavern. I find it rather resembles a stable after a pack of untrained hounds has been through it." The slight was so perfectly aimed, so dryly delivered, that several of the more sober guests winced. Cassian laughed, loud and artificial. "A woman of wit, bravo! But I assume the noise and the ambiance are not conducive to the moral instruction of my sister, I dare say the sight alone is enough to send a proper lady running for a nunnery." She reached the bottom of the stairs. She didn't look at him. She looked at the smoldering cigar that had been discarded hours ago, still emitting a thin, acrid ribbon of smoke from a mahogany side table near the draperies. No, my lord, the noise is temporary and the ambience merely offensive. The fire hazard, however, is of genuine concern. Before Cassian could process the sudden shift in focus, Eleanor was moving with a startling, decisive efficiency. She walked straight to a small ornamental cistern holding a potted palm. Without hesitation, she tipped the entire contents, soil, water, and all, into the plant's bronze base. She then went to the hall closet, pulled out a fire bucket, placed there, ironically, as part of the estate's safety regulations, and marched back to the scene of the party. She located the nearest footman, a young, bewildered lad named Thomas, who was attempting to hide behind a column. Thomas, she commanded, her voice suddenly booming with authority, fill this with water from the nearest spigot. Immediately. The lad, galvanized by her unquestionable tone, sprinted off. He returned moments later with a brimming bucket. Eleanor took the heavy bucket from him, her muscles bracing under the weight, and walked directly toward the smoldering cigar on the table. But before she reached the table, she executed a perfectly smooth pivot, her eyes fixed on the ceiling. "Oh, my word," she exclaimed, her voice pitched in sudden, sharp alarm. "I do believe the chandelier is smoking!" With a deliberate, powerful heave, she swung the entire bucket of cold water in a wide arc. It did not, of course, hit the chandelier. It doused the smoldering cigar, which was nowhere near the draperies, as she had claimed, and in the same sweeping motion drenched the three closest gentlemen who had been attempting to rouse themselves from the floor, including a particularly offensive marquise who was snoring near the hearth. A collective gasp swept through the foyer. The water, muddy from the cistern, left three stunned, dripping, and now quite sober young men in its wake. Cassian stared utterly speechless, his mouth slightly ajar. Eleanor Sharpe set the empty bucket down with a soft, authoritative clunk. She then turned, wiped a stray droplet of water from her pristine black sleeve, and addressed the dripping marquise with chilling politeness. "My sincerest apologies, gentlemen," she said, her green eyes glinting. "A safety concern. I mistook the acrid smell of your cheap brandy for the smoke of a genuine conflagration. Lord Vale, might I suggest you have the servants clear this refuse immediately? The foyer is a thoroughfare, not a pigsty." She gave Cassian a swift, cool look of profound disdain, a look that summarized her thoughts on him, his friends, and his elaborate, childish performance. "If you will excuse me, my lord, I believe I am due for breakfast before I begin my instruction of Lady Lydia." And with that, Eleanor Sharpe walked past the wreckage, her shoulders straight, and disappeared into the breakfast parlor. The first point, unequivocally, went to her. Cassian stood there, frozen, amidst the shocked silence and the slowly gathering rage of his drenched guests. He was not angry. He was intrigued and infuriated in equal measure by her sheer refusal to be shocked or shamed. She had turned his debauchery into a trivial housekeeping problem, and in doing so, had robbed him of his desired reaction. From the top of the staircase, a small, delightful sound broke the silence. Lady Lydia, wearing a magnificent, if slightly rumpled, blue silk dressing gown, was leaning over the mahogany railing, clutching her stomach. She wasn't just smiling. She was engaged in a full, silent paroxysm of laughter, her shoulders shaking with mirth. She pointed an accusatory finger at her brother. "You deserved that, Cassian. You entirely and magnificently deserved that." Lydia descended the stairs, her laughter subsiding into a bright, knowing smile. She paused next to her dripping brother, picking up a stray, half-filled champagne glass. "She's splendid," Lydia declared, sipping the leftover bubbly. "You hired the strictest woman in England to make me run, and instead you've hired the first person who treated your little games like the absurdity they are. I shall keep her." And she didn't even yell. Lydia swept past Cassian, pausing only to wink. "The game, brother dear, is far more interesting than your typical gambling, and I, for one, intend to watch." Cassian stood alone in the ruins of his perfect scandal. He dismissed his friends with a curt wave and called for the house steward. As the servants began the tedious process of cleaning, he remained in the foyer, staring at the wet patch on the marble floor. He had intended to humiliate her, to provoke her moral superiority. Instead, she had demonstrated a tactical coolness and a dry, cutting wit that completely outflanked him. She saw his behavior not as sin, but as a poorly executed strategy, and then she had deployed a superior, wet, and deeply humiliating strategy of her own. The woman is a weapon, he thought, a familiar, cold excitement blooming in his chest. His heart, long dormant, felt a strange, thrilling pump. This was not the tedious dance of seduction or the dull predictability of high society. This was a challenge. Cassian ran a hand over his jaw, a slow, predatory smile finally spreading across his lips. "Very well, Miss Sharpe," he murmured to the empty room. "Point one to you. But a true rake never folds after the first hand." He began to plot his counterattack, not a grand public display of ruin, but something subtle, something personal, to crack the unflappable composure of Eleanor Sharpe. He needed to find the weakness in her armor, the chink in the steel of her dignity, and he would start by observing the way she interacted with his sister. Chapter 3. The Geometry of Rebellion. For 2 weeks, Cassian and Eleanor maintained a perfect icy distance, yet their conflict was the invisible architecture of Atherton Hall. Cassian continued his deliberate campaign of disruption, moving the time of dinner without warning, replacing the floral arrangements with absurd, gaudy statuary, and once ordering the staff to swap the labels on all the wine bottles in the cellar. He was not trying to provoke her resignation now. He was trying to provoke a reaction, anger, fear, a breach of her granite composure. Eleanor merely adapted. Dinner was served precisely on time, regardless of the drawing room clock. She used the statuary for lessons in classical sculpture and geometry. When the wine labels were swapped, she simply informed the butler that, given the lord's clear indifference to vintage, they would be using the bottles as weights for Lydia's exercise regime. Their greatest conflict, however, centered on Lady Lydia. Lydia, initially amused by the governess, soon found herself subject to a curriculum that was rigorous, demanding, and utterly unlike the superficial instruction she had anticipated. Eleanor did not care if Lydia could play the pianoforte prettily. She cared if Lydia understood the physics of sound. Cassian expected Lydia to run screaming back to her room, thus giving him the excuse he needed. Instead, Lydia was flourishing under the unexpected challenge. She spent hours cloistered with Eleanor, emerging with ink-stained fingers and a fierce, thoughtful light in her eyes. One rainy Tuesday afternoon, Cassian, armed with a finely honed sneer and the intention of watching Eleanor fail, tracked them down. They were in the smaller, less-used library, a quiet room filled with centuries of dusty, leather-bound knowledge. He stopped in the doorway, intending to interrupt with a biting remark about the governess turning his sister into a bluestocking. Lydia was not studying French embroidery or society manners. She was hunched over a vast sheet of parchment, a compass and ruler in hand, calculating the geometry of a complex archway from one of the estate's ruined follies. Eleanor was standing over her, but she wasn't simply dictating. She was debating. "The flaw in your design, Lydia," Eleanor was saying, tapping the parchment with the edge of her ruler, "is that you are relying on traditional Roman masonry, which fails to account for the lateral forces of the Vale chalk. You must use the Gothic model. The pointed arch disperses the weight more efficiently." "But the Roman model is stronger aesthetically," Lydia countered, not looking up. "The round arch suggests stability. The Gothic suggests a desperate reach for the heavens." "Stability is useless if the structure collapses," Eleanor shot back, without heat, only logic. "And desperate reaches are often what save a soul. I am making sure, Lady Lydia, that your education is in structure, not mere decoration, because decoration is fragile." The blow landed, sharp and clean, directly on the bruise of Cassian's own guilt. Decoration is fragile. He, Lord Cassian Vale, was a masterful piece of brittle, handsome decoration. He pushed off the doorframe and entered the room. "Miss Sharpe," he sneered, his tone attempting to recapture his usual careless disdain, "I see you are filling my sister's head with tedious arithmetic. Are you trying to make a blue stocking out of her?" Eleanor turned, her movement economical and swift. Her eyes, those unsettling chips of green, were intensely bright with the passion of the lesson, a fire he had never seen in her before. "Lord Vale," she said, her voice perfectly steady, "I am ensuring your sister has the capacity to build her own life, should yours, or society's, fail her." She leaned down, pointing to a volume of philosophy on the table. "She will inherit a vast sum of money, but only if she is tamed to your father's satisfaction. That wealth will be useless if she remains a slave to fashion and fear. I am teaching her mathematics, philosophy, and how to think, because I'm making sure she never has to rely on a man who sees her as a burden to be managed." The second blow struck deeper than the first, hitting the raw nerve of his deepest insecurity. He realized in that moment that Eleanor wasn't teaching Lydia. She was arming her. She wasn't preparing her for a season. She was preparing her for life. Cassian found himself for the first time without a clever retort. The truth of her accusation, that he saw his own sister as a burden to be managed, was undeniable. He had never bothered to look past the surface of her youthful rebellion. Eleanor, the governess he had hired to destroy his sister's chances, saw Lydia more clearly than he, her own brother, did. Lydia looked up at Cassian then, her gaze surprisingly sympathetic. "Miss Sharpe is right, Cassian. You never ask me what I think. You only ask me what I did." Cassian felt a sudden, profound lurch of self-reproach. "Perhaps," he finally managed, his voice stiff, "you should inform me of the curriculum. In the future." Eleanor's expression softened the merest fraction of a millimeter. It was not a look of triumph, but of measured, professional acknowledgement. "I would be happy to provide you with my quarterly reports, my lord," she said. He left the library quickly, retreating not from her victory, but from the sudden, clear vision she had given him of his own failure as a brother. The game had shifted. Cassian's initial motivation to drive Eleanor away was now complicated by a protective instinct toward Lydia. If he succeeded in sending Eleanor away, he would send away the best influence his sister had ever known. That evening, he went to his personal, rarely used account books. He found himself poring over them, calculating figures, trying to understand the logistics of the Vale Trust, not to find a loophole for himself, but to gauge the true risk to Lydia. As he worked, a profound realization began to dawn. He had sought to humiliate Eleanor Sharpe by exposing her to his decadent lifestyle. Instead, she had forced him to look past his own facade of debauchery and intellectual frustration and face the very emptiness of his life. The crack in his armor had widened. He was no longer simply trying to win. He was beginning to recognize the existence of a higher standard, and for the first time in years, he felt a faint, disturbing desire to reach it. He had sought to manage the problem of his sister, and Eleanor Sharpe was teaching him that the true problem was the unexamined life of Lord Cassian Vale. Chapter 4: The Folly of Frustration. Eleanor Sharpe was rarely alone. Her life, by necessity, was a carefully choreographed exercise in public propriety and professional rigidity. But even the strongest armor has a weak point, and Eleanor's was worry. A week after their intense confrontation in the library, Cassian found her at the edge of the estate's grounds, tucked away inside the crumbled, ivy-covered ruin of the Roman-style folly that Lydia had been discussing. The structure, ironically, was exactly the failure of design Eleanor had lectured on, beautiful but fundamentally unstable. She was seated on a slab of fallen marble, her back to him, her shoulders shaking with a silent, furious intensity. She wasn't weeping with the delicate society tears of a woman hurt by a careless word. These were the raw, silent, furious tears of frustration, a fierce, exhausted grief born of powerlessness. Cassian stopped, hidden behind a tall yew hedge. His first Rakehell instinct, the instinct to mock, to disarm her with cruelty, to seize the upper hand, died a sudden, brutal death in his throat. He had spent weeks trying to provoke emotion, yet the sight of her genuine suffering was jarring, extinguishing the thrill of the game. He realized the tears weren't about him or Lydia or the indignity of her position. They were about something private, something deep. He waited until her breathing settled before quietly stepping out of the shadows. "Miss Sharpe?" he asked, his voice low and utterly devoid of its usual mocking cadence. Eleanor sprang up as if struck, instantly composed, her hands flying to her face to wipe away the evidence of her breakdown. Her eyes, still shining with unshed water, were wide with shock and a flush of deep humiliation. "My lord," she said, her voice strained but regaining its control. "I apologize. I was merely composing myself before the afternoon lesson." She tried to turn away, but Cassian moved, blocking her path with a soft finality. He saw a crumpled sheet of paper clutched tightly in her hand. "That's a letter," he stated, his gaze falling on the hastily scrawled, official-looking script. Eleanor pressed the paper to her chest, her posture becoming rigid, defensive. It is private correspondence, Lord Vale. It has nothing to do with my duties here. Everything is connected to your duties here, Cassian countered gently. You are too composed to break down over a trivial matter. It must be a catastrophe of some magnitude. Has it to do with Lady Lydia? No, she whispered, her chin lifting slightly. It has to do with my family. They are facing. She stopped, biting her lip, unable to utter the final word. Cassian didn't need the word. He knew the plight of the genteel poor. Eviction, he finished for her, the word a flat stone in the quiet air. Because they were swindled or indebted or simply too proud to manage their own affairs? Eleanor's face paled. They lost everything. My father trusted the wrong man, and now my mother and sister. She cut herself off, shame burning in her eyes. It doesn't matter. It is my problem, and I will resolve it. She looked straight at him, her armor momentarily patched, her fierce pride reasserting itself. The terms of our employment do not permit me to ask for an advance, nor would I ever. I know your terms, Miss Sharpe, Cassian interrupted, his voice surprisingly kind. The sight of her unflappable moral rigor colliding with the brutal realities of destitution stripped away his rakish self-interest entirely. He saw not the formidable governess, but the terrified daughter, fighting a world that valued women only for their dowries or their obedience. He reached into the inner pocket of his coat. He pulled out his wallet, took out a blank check, and smoothly wrote a sum that was astronomical, enough to not only pay off the immediate eviction threat, but to secure a small, safe cottage for her family for years. He held it out to her. Take it, he commanded, his voice strange even to his own ears. Eleanor stared at the check as if it were a venomous snake. A bribe? To what end, my lord? My silence? My virtue? Cassian shook his head, pushing the check into her unresisting hand. He didn't touch her, but the movement was an undeniable gesture of intimacy. A loan, he said, his voice raw. Not a bribe. Pay me back when you can, or don't. I don't care. It is an investment in my sister's education. If you are distracted, you cannot teach her. If you are destitute, you must leave. And if you leave now, Lydia loses the one person who has taught her how to build a proper arch. He paused, letting the silence hold the weight of his unexpected kindness. I am not asking for anything in return, Eleanor. I am simply recognizing that you are fighting a battle that is larger than the trivial war we have constructed here, and I do not wish to be the man who stands by and watches the good side lose. The look she gave him then was the major turning point. It was the first time she saw him, not the rake. Her eyes searched his face, stripping away the handsome veneer of debauchery to find the sliver of decency, the shred of honor, hidden beneath years of boredom and self-loathing. Her fierce green gaze was wet, but now it was with an emotion that was neither grief nor anger. It was a painful, disorienting gratitude. Lord Vale, she finally managed, her voice barely a breath. I do not know how to repay such generosity. You already are, Cassian said, turning abruptly so she wouldn't see the sudden, alarming confusion of his own feelings. You are giving my sister a future. You are giving me a damned interesting enemy. Now go and secure your family. I expect you to be back for afternoon tea. Do not be late, Miss Sharpe. I dislike poor timekeeping. He walked away, leaving her alone in the ruined folly, clutching the check that represented salvation. He did not look back. Cassian felt an exhilarating rush, not of triumph, but of strange, unaccustomed honor. He had spent his adult life proving he had a price. In that moment, he had proven the opposite. He had seen the unflappable Miss Sharpe's breaking point, and instead of exploiting it, he had offered her a shield. He knew, with a sudden, unnerving certainty, that the battle of wills was truly over. Something far more dangerous and difficult was beginning. Chapter 5. The Charged Silence of the Library. The loan changed everything. Eleanor deposited the check the next morning, securing her family's future with the quiet efficiency of a general fortifying a position. She never mentioned it to Cassian, and he never asked. The money was simply the new, unspoken foundation of their relationship. No longer employer and employee, but two people bound by a debt of honor, a secret that held the key to the vulnerability of both. The War of Wills did not end, but it transformed into a dangerous truce. Their battles moved from the grand foyer and the public display of scandal to the intimate, quiet arenas of the estate. The reading nooks, the estate office, and, most frequently, the sprawling library after midnight. Cassian had, until Eleanor's arrival, confined his intellectual energy to calculating odds at the gaming table. Now he found himself reading again. Not the sensational pamphlets of the day, but the dusty volumes of philosophy and political theory that lined the library shelves, the very books Eleanor used to challenge Lydia. The late-night debates began casually. Cassian would find her reading late, a single lamp illuminating her stern, focused profile. He would pour a brandy, settle into the chair opposite her, and comment on her selection. Adam Smith, he drawled one night, leaning back, the scent of expensive amber and brandy mingling with the dry smell of old paper. A tedious endorsement of human selfishness, wouldn't you say? You, Miss Sharpe, are hardly a champion of self-interest. Eleanor did not look up immediately. When she did, her eyes were sharp with challenge. Lord Vale, I am a fierce champion of self-reliance. I endorse the logic of Smith, if not the application of men like yourself. You mistake his theory for a license to be dissolute. Their debates were exhilarating, a fierce intellectual sparring that ignited a fire within Cassian that gambling and drink had failed to touch in years. He saw in her mind a rigorous, dazzling landscape of logic and morality, and he found himself tearing down his own arguments, forcing himself to truly think, just to earn the slightest nod of acknowledgement from her. The air between them began to crackle with everything they weren't saying. It was more than intellectual. The concentration in her posture, the rare, triumphant flash of wit when she cornered him in a logical trap, the precise movement of her lips as she articulated a complex idea, all of it began to chip away at his calculated boredom, replacing it with a keen, unsettling desire. He, who had sworn off feeling anything genuine, was beginning to feel everything. The truce was tested severely at the Countess of Waverley's annual ball. Lydia, guided by Eleanor's firm but subtle hand, made a respectable entrance, attracting several eligible if somewhat dull suitors. Eleanor, dressed in a borrowed gown of deep midnight blue, a concession to society that she endured with visible stoicism, hovered at the edges. Cassian watched her from across the ballroom. He saw the way she carried herself, her dignity a silent rebuke to the frivolity around them. He saw how many eyes, male and female, were drawn to her unexpected, intelligent beauty. He cut through the crowded floor, his progress effortless and arrogant, and stopped directly in front of her. "Miss Sharpe," he murmured, offering his hand with a theatrical bow, "you must honor me with a waltz." She hesitated, her green eyes widening slightly in alarm. She knew what this meant, a public declaration of proximity, a blurring of the rigid lines between the family and the hired help. "My lord, I am employed here. It would be highly inappropriate," she whispered, her formality the last shred of her defense. "Inappropriate?" he scoffed, his voice low, intimate, and dangerous. "I am Lord Atherton. I make the rules, and I am utterly bored of adhering to yours. Come." He did not wait for her consent. He simply took her hand, his touch, warm and firm, shocking against the fine cotton of her glove, and led her onto the floor. As they began the waltz, the intimacy became unbearable. Cassian pulled her too close, his hand resting almost proprietarily at the small of her back. She did not pull away. The distance between their bodies, which had always been the vast chasm between their stations, vanished. He watched her face. Her composure was slipping. A slight flush rose on her neck, and her breathing hitched almost imperceptibly with each turn. "You are surprisingly light on your feet, Miss Sharpe," he breathed, his voice rougher than intended. "One must master balance when one's livelihood depends on maintaining appearances," she retorted, her eyes locked on his lapel. "And what appearances are we maintaining now, Eleanor?" he asked, using her first name, the first time he had allowed himself the liberty. She looked up, her gaze finally meeting his. The shock of recognition, the fierce, undeniable attraction that flared between them was almost physical. It was the same thrilling danger as a razor's edge. "A necessary fiction," she whispered, her voice husky. Before the dance ended, a small catastrophe occurred. The delicate clip securing the heavy coils of her dark hair came loose, and a thick rope of hair fell down her back. Eleanor instinctively raised her hands to fix it, embarrassed, but Cassian was quicker. He reached out, his fingers brushing the sensitive skin of her neck as he gently found the errant pin, his eyes never leaving hers. He leaned in, his breath warm against her ear. "Allow me," he murmured, his voice a low vibration that traveled through her entire body. The moment was charged, electric. His touch was brief, professional, yet utterly intimate. He was fixing her hair, an action usually reserved for a husband or a lover. They were surrounded by society, but utterly alone in that fragile space of touch and breath. Both were visibly shaken by the encounter. Cassian knew with stark clarity that he had set out to unravel her, and instead he was weaving himself into the fabric of her life. He pulled her back a formal step as the music ended, his hand lingering on her waist a moment too long. "Thank you for the dance," he said, the words heavy with double meaning. Eleanor merely nodded, her eyes dark, her lips parted. She fled the ballroom moments later, retreating to her room to recover her balance, leaving Cassian standing in the center of the floor, the master of the house feeling like a raw, exposed amateur. The truce was over. They were no longer enemies, but two antagonists locked in a state of mutual escalating desire. You have just finished part one of our story, The Ultimatum and the Alliance. Part two begins with a swift, brutal public attack. Cassian will be forced to choose between the man he was and the man Eleanor sees. Will he finally defend her, or will his cowardice destroy the one thing he finally cares about? Don't go anywhere. Part two is coming next, and the stakes have never been higher.